Welcome everyone to our next in the series of K-Core Zoom presentations. Our speaker today is David Pollock. He is the past chair of the Canadian Club of Rome. He's presently the coordinator for finance and administration for a charity, Citizens for Public Justice. He has been the executive director of BioCap Foundation, as well as the executive director of the Pembina Institute. He has a very rich background and very rich network in advancement of holistic and sustainable solutions. His presentation today is titled Developing Policies That Reduce Inequality and Improve Genuine Wealth, Including Climate Justice. You want to go ahead, please, David?
Thanks very much, Art. Before I get into the main subject matter, I know you're all familiar with Art's many investments in his solar panels and his various systems to reduce his carbon footprint. So I thought I would just start by displaying my cashmere scarf, which is one of the technologies that we use in our household to reduce our carbon footprint, along with our electric lawnmower and electric assist bicycles. So while modest, they're all small contributions that can be made. So I want to display my technology to start. And it's cool in our house, but quite manageable. So then the second thing I want to say before I move to the presentation itself is I didn't know at what level exactly to pitch this presentation, and it may be old hat for a number of you. It may be not as sophisticated because I wasn't quite sure how to broach it, but I think you'll find some of it interesting. And so let's kick off with the other caveat that in the end, when I looked at the length of what I was developing, I've developed an approach, but we don't talk a lot about climate change in this particular presentation. I'll share my screen now with you all. And we'll go from the beginning to the slideshow. Good. So many of you will recall being at the annual general meeting when I attempted to gather up some of the work of the team when we did some initial reporting to you on the progress we were making on the Pathways project, when we were trying to look at can Canadians really deal with in a meaningful way the climate change challenge we face as Canadians and make a contribution to the global solutions that need to occur. Shortly, there'll be more formal reports available from the follow-up writing that's been done since these early days. But when we looked at Pathways, one of the things we certainly became fully aware of is that carbon reduction for Canada, the government had not used useful measurement tools to ask the questions about what was biophysically possible. Governments continually set targets and continue to set targets without fully exploring what our resource base, our infrastructure, our physical resources will permit. In Pathways, we will propose a new methodology to aid policy development, and that will be forthcoming. But today, there we go. Today, I wanted to look more generally at how we might align policy with the common good. I wanted to thank Gord Kubanek, who spent an hour doing some of the graphics work, including this little cartoon that he put in to a slide here, as he's much more comfortable with PowerPoint than I am. And I wanted to give credit to someone many of you should or will be aware of. Mark Anilski was one of my colleagues when he was the senior green economy guy when I was the executive director at Pembina. And we worked very closely on a project together. And I had a chat with him in the last few days to get updated about what some of his work is doing. But I did want to share with you the sort of leading edge project that we undertook back in the late 1990s. Whoops. So one of the things I want to suggest is that societies, by and large, we like to measure things. We need to measure things to have an idea of possible outcomes and consequences, sometimes costs. And I'm suggesting to you that if you look carefully at what every society measures, it will tell you quite a lot about what's possible in terms of shaping useful policy or policy that benefits elites or other groups within society. So measurement is a very important instrument that we use in policy development. So there's a little quiz here, and I wasn't sure if we'd have an international audience, but if you run across these, what do we recognize? You will see a number of choices, and I have a prediction here. And the prediction is that you'll recognize either all of those or all but one. And the one that you may not be as familiar with is GPI indicator, the genuine progress indicator. And that's one of the things we'll consider this afternoon. I want to argue that supplementing the gross domestic product indicators with GPI, genuine progress indicators, or other sustainable well-being indicators is quite critical if we're to move toward a more sustainable society. So we need to ask the question, what's wrong with how we tend to measure progress? Now, economists will tell you that the gross domestic product is not supposed to be equivalent to the well-being of society or how well we're doing. It's simply a specific economic measure. The problem is that if you ask nearly any politician or journalist, or I dare say the general public, that you get into a sense that the gross domestic product is really indicating if it's going up, we're in a better state than if it's going down or if it's remaining constant. I'm going to look today at the distinction between what we measure when we are looking at more in a society as opposed to better. So this takes us into the heart of some value discussions, which are of interest to all of us. I want to go back first, though, to the GDP. It's one of the first economic indicators that most people hear about, I think. And if you ask any politician, you'll, I think, come up with that result. It's also highly significant if you are a country wanting to get financial support from the World Bank or the IMF. They really tend to judge your financial health very much based on the GDP that you have as a society. But at its most simply, GDP does not measure what we value as a society, and it does not really even measure our wealth or our genuine wealth. Back in 1968, there's quotations that many people are familiar with, where Robert Kennedy is speaking at Kansas State University in '68, where he says, "Too much and too long, we seem to have surrendered community excellence and community values in the mere accumulation of material things." He goes on to say the following. I'll just let you read it. Can everybody read the screen? Okay.
Yes, your sound is good and the picture's good.
It measures everything in short except that which makes life worthwhile, he argues. GDP simply measures the flow of money in the economy, so that we have this strange anomaly that money spent repairing damage from a hurricane increases the GDP. I would argue that it violates one of the first rules of accounting. It treats the liquidation of assets such as oil and timber simply as income and not a reduction in inventory of our assets or of our natural capital. is a whole litany of what you could call crimes against real wealth in a society or genuine progress. I would argue it does the following. So these are important, that it doesn't take account of the effects of inequality of income and spending power. It doesn't, it counts things as economic gain, which we clearly see as negative aspects of society in terms of crime and imprisonment. And yet it leaves out important things like the value of housework, parenting, volunteering, count for nothing. Marilyn Waring, of course, back in the 80s was quick to point these shortcomings of the United Nations work on national accounts on which the GDP is based, critique them from a feminist perspective, and argued the same as that last point. In addition, it takes this is the GDP now, it takes every single environmental calamity, every polluting activity, and then again in repairing the damage as additive to the GDP. It does not account for the depletion or degradation of natural resources or the environment. It treats war expenditures as economic gain, both during the destruction and the rebuilding phases, and it ignores the liabilities of living on debt and foreign borrowing. So that's the GDP. Now, I'll just say that it's not very often in my life that I would argue that a book has had a profound influence on my life. But I was working at the National Anglican Church of Canada as their first economic justice staff person back in the mid-90s, when I first came across a book by Daly and Cobb. Daly, the small is beautiful style economist, if you like, who was chief economist at the World Bank at one stage, and John Cobb, Jr., a renowned process theologian who followed the work of Alfred Lord Whitehead. And the two of them wrote a book that you may have heard of, many of you may be very familiar with it, called For the Common Good, Redirecting the Economy Toward Community, the Environment, and a Sustainable Future. I was so taken by that book that I went to my colleagues at Church House and I said, I must go and meet with one of them and do a series of television interviews. And they said, well, nobody wants to watch talking heads and you don't have resources for that. And we don't think it's a very good idea. And I was passionate about this. And I finally convinced them that if I could raise my own money through a grant, that they would allow me to proceed. And although they were quite skeptical, and I got a small grant that allowed me to fly to California. Herman Daly was not available, but John Cobb was. And we did a series of 10 half-hour television interviews. And I remember taking the cheapest props possible with me. We rented a studio nearby, Claremont College in the States. And I had a blow-up balloon, a beach ball with the map of the Earth on it. And I remember my grandmother's old giant hat pin that we could use when we wanted to show the dangers impinging on the Earth. And that book and that series of videos, I still actually have them. It was distributed reasonably widely back after I did them about 1992 or 93. But that work has stayed with me as a very important kind of seminal work in my understanding and vocabulary. So I became aware that a number of people developed what they called these genuine progress indicators. It's widely been duplicated now in many different countries. There are some states in the United States that use what they call these GPI accounts, genuine progress indicators. And what they do is they've developed a methodology that's pretty much common throughout. They take 26 variables from personal consumption through to the value of household and volunteer work and cost of family breakdown. And they look at each of these added on aspects and they make a determination, they make a value judgment about whether that's seen as a positive or a negative. And then they either add or subtract it from the GDP. Now, the only one that I'll comment on a little bit more, among experts, or so-called experts in any case, there's a great debate that goes on about what you should do for adjustments for income distribution. I don't want to be particularly technical today, and I'm not sure that I really can be anymore, but I want to just talk for a moment about what they do to adjust the income that's generated in society, how they deal with inequality. So in the years when there's greater inequality in society, inequality of income, which gets measured, that creates what's called a higher Gini value. It's a proxy for greater inequality. So they then deflate those consumption expenditures by a factor that's equivalent to that percentage change in the Gini inequality factor. So for example, in a year when inequality has risen by 5% according to that indicator, the well-being derived from consumption expenditures is divided by a factor of 1.05 to reflect the relatively reduced welfare value of consumption expenditures. And the reason that's done philosophically is that people would argue that on the whole, when lower income individuals receive a decreasing share of national income, their well-being declines more sharply than would that of higher income individuals where their share of the national income decreased in like amount. Having higher incomes to start with, a relative reduction in the share of your total income received if you're a top earner, it's not nearly as likely to lead to any drastic reduction in the well-being of those individuals. So that's, in very general terms, how that factor for, as your inequality rises in society, the GPI indicators cause a drop in what then gets shown on your graph of how well you're doing. And you can see that when these indicators are rolled up into a graph, this is using the 26 indicators where certain things are added to GDP, but you can see substantially that a lot has been subtracted. So we'll see that over the years, right up to this goes to 2002 and starts in 1950, an almost continuous increase in the gross domestic product, but the per capita genuine progress index is much more horizontal than that. Now, in 2001, I was at the Pembina Institute, and with really the brilliance, I would argue, of Mark Anilski, he and I had multiple conversations about how to do this most effectively. And it actually ended up being, I think, the first full set of accounts in the world where we added in, to make everything transparent, we used GPI or GDP as one of the indicators, but in total we had access to 51 indicators, and we wanted to try to ask two questions in that report. I'm not trying to take a shot at Alberta here particularly, but it's where I lived and the province that we chose when Pembina's main offices were out there. So that's where we had access to the data. I dare say that other provinces in Canada would show some similar results, but because of the huge oil and gas resource base in Alberta, much more drastic the results in looking at the genuine progress indicators in Alberta. And this was during the Ralph Klein years. And I remember a very heated session with many deputy ministers and Mark and I in the room, ADMs, director generals, and deputy ministers, all trying to suppress the publication of this report. But in fact, it got a front page status on the Globe and Mail. And what I did as a result of those conversations, as I indicated, it was experimental. It was the first time, and we welcomed any criticism to try to improve the work, but we weren't going to suppress the work because we thought it was quite important. So we were trying to ask the question of how well is Alberta really doing? Well, of course, really begs the question of all kinds of values, but we'll get to those in a moment. And the other significant question was to try to explore how sustainable is the foundation of Alberta society and economy. So just to review a little bit more what the GPI, the Genuine Progress Indicators, try to measure, what we tried to measure in the project. It creates a balance sheet over a specified period of time to look at the well-being of individuals, communities, and the environment. And much more controversially, because it tries to monetize a sustainable income statement, it creates a national or provincial, in this case, provincial income statement that's fundamentally different from the gross domestic product one. The GPI accounting system, it's built on traditional bookkeeping systems, ledgers, a balance sheet, income statement. But we believe, at that time we believed, it could be used to prepare sustainability reports to citizens. It measures progress and changes in the condition of all living and built assets, similar in the way a business measures its financial health. It also recognizes that not all expenditures, as we were saying, contribute to well-being. Car crashes, suicides, etc., shouldn't be treated as costs. They should be treated as costs, not revenues. Then the GPI income statement subtracts the human, social, ecological, and natural resource costs incurred to generate income. It also recognizes the positive contributions of unpaid work, volunteering, childcare, elder care, and housework. This is just a slide that Gord came up with. I think it's drawn from India, looking at the distinction between average hours worked if you're a female in India versus a male, and the amount of unpaid work versus paid work. So to drill down a little further, in terms of what's in the genuine progress indicators that we used at Pembina, we had 5 different kinds of accounts. We had time use accounts, looking at how we allocate our time between paid work, parenting, elder care, commuting, housework, free time. We measured all of those. We looked at social capital accounts, things like poverty, inequality, family breakdown, crime, participation in voting, democracy, social cohesion, human health and wellness accounts, looking at things like life expectancy, premature mortality, suicides, obesity, and lifestyles. And then the whole list, I won't read them here, but the key ones in the natural resource and environmental accounts, many there that were included. And we found ways to track and measure each one of those indicators. And then finally, we also included the traditional financial and built capital, including GDP. We looked at trade, disposable income, the directional movement of weekly wages, consumption, taxes, savings, and so on. There they all are together. We broke them into the 3 different categories. I'll just review these a little more clearly with you. So in the economic, we were able to, partly the determination of what's included are what we had good data for from a period of about 1961 through to 1999, and ways we thought we would come up with reasonable methodology to measure these various things. But partly it was values based in terms of what we understood at that time to be things which society talks about values, wishes to have more of or wishes to have less of. So on this personal societal, you'll see that things like commuting are included because we could measure it and we know it's a factor for some people. Certainly things like obesity and drug use and auto crashes, problem gambling. The bottom one may be cut off, voter participation. And then finally in the environmental, now oil and gas reserve life was looking at traditional reserves, whereas the oil sands was broken out as a separate category looking at reserve life. And then when we were looking at the carbon budget deficit, what we were looking at there were the various sinks that existed in Alberta in terms of forestry versus the amount of cost of greenhouse gas emissions and what kind of deficit that created for society. And therefore, what direction was that going in over a period of time that we wanted to plot? Same with the ecological footprint in terms of the hectares per capita within Alberta. How much was the footprint in the 1960s versus 1999? You can see while with these kind of accounts, the Alberta government may have been a little antsy when they were very proud of talking in the decline years of the Alberta advantage, which was severely brought into question by the results which we published and which were widely used. This was the result when we rolled up these two indexes. You can see GPI fell from 61 to 87 and remained pretty stagnant through the 90s. And with the exception of recession periods, you can see the GPI is dramatically higher over that same period from 61 to 99. Now, after I left the Pembina Institute, there's been some work done, some good work done on what's happened since. And this shows the continuation of those same measurements in an index form. Now, what I find interesting, the raw data is less debatable than the sustainable income statement, because on the income statement, you have to put everything into dollars. But what we did methodologically here is we took all 51 of the indicators and we took the highest, the very best year was marked at 100, and then accommodation was made on the graph for whether 1999 was better or worse than the unit of 100. And so you can see, for example, that economic growth at the very top of the picture is at the outside level. That's showing that economic growth has never been higher than in 1999. However, if you look at problem gambling, it's an open space, an open SOAR, which shows that problem gambling is at about the highest. So notionally, if you look at the solid area, which is plotted here, a beautiful society would be one that had this circle solidly filled in, because you're putting the positives on the outside and the negatives are moving onto the inside. We'll just look a little more carefully at that. This is another one up. This is 1999. I didn't know which one you could see the most easily, but you can see it's sort of divided in the circle into liabilities and then into assets. I'll get more specific in this one too, but it's interesting. This one ranked things by order of scores. So if we just go down to a slide, this one is showing the things that came out highest that in 1999 seem to be doing better than in the 1960s. So for example, you had far less premature mortality in 1999 than you did 30 years previously. Your life expectancy had gone up. So had your free time, and your educational attainment measured by university degrees and highest degree by population of educational level attained were all at the highest. And so you'll see that all of these graphed in at about 80 to 100 points. Not quite as well. This is 60 to 80 points. So you'll see that by 1999, water quality was not at its highest during that period. Auto crashes were increasing Suicides were deemed to be negative for society. Some are more controversial, but this one clearly. Suicides, that meant, were going up, were higher than some other periods during that whole time period. Public infrastructure was not at its very best. Air quality was not as its very best. Voter participation. The oil sands reserve life was still high, but not as high as it was in the 60s. You can see some deterioration in timber sustainability. If we go down further, the ones that were worst. So you can think as a policymaker, if you're thinking about the well-being of society, things that would hit your radar screen for serious contemplation is you would want to take seriously what's happening on the obesity scale, on the oil and gas reserve life. Although if you think some assets need to be stranded, as many of us do, that may not have been seen as a negative, but at this time we were measuring it as a decrease. Taxes, even though we're fond in Ontario of harping about the lack of provincial tax, when you take total taxation paid in Albertan society, it had been going up substantially and was at its peak in 1999. Carbon budget deficit going up all the time. Same with forest fragmentation, problem gambling, wetlands being destroyed, drug use going up. Economic diversity, they've made several attempts supposedly to increase economic diversity, but the results by 1999 were not at all encouraging. Greenhouse gas emissions, you can see, is right toward the inner side. Savings rate. So these are signals that as a society has certain things of fragility, and of course some are much more important than others. Now the greenhouse gases we would view as an existential problem. So following that work, and it's still today housed at the University of Guelph, the University of Waterloo, there's well-being measurement, which is being undertaken by universities. And there was an act through the House of Commons in 2003, which you can read there for yourselves. So it's clear that that was passed, but the information initially, when Paul Martin was there, was really intended for use by the Minister of Finance. This wasn't something that was broadcast strongly and transparently. And today there are reports annually to Parliament on some of the sustainable indicators, but it's not what's used when you formulate a budget for the country. It's still the GDP, which is really carrying the vast majority of the baggage. So these have not really been integrated in highly useful ways. We had a dream at one point that just as you give the nightly weather report to Canadians, you would give the GPI index, on a monthly basis or whenever it could be tracked, so that if Canadians really knew what was going on in each of these sectors, it would create good grist for political advocacy as to what was more important to Canadians. But these have not gone nearly as far as we might wish, and not as far as a number of other countries and societies. Here you'll see another one from 2005. Because many of you know Gord, I'll indicate to you that was not his graphic. That came from my wayward friend Mark Anilski's graphics. But you look at the best year of GPI is 1961, almost the exact opposite of the GDP. This shows that you can do a study based on a smaller region. This is for Edmonton itself. And what's interesting, of course, is you can plot these 2008, you could look at 2007 and blow them up, 2006, and it can give good information for policymakers that are really concerned with the overall well-being of society. That's the index. You can see it's interesting at times, sometimes when the GDP is dropping, the quality of life, we would argue, is actually going up. Now, the overall Canadian Index of Well-being, which I told you is still being tracked at some of the universities, this goes right up to 2014, and it's showing this growth of gross domestic product at 38%, and the index of well-being has increased just marginally in comparison. My friend and colleague Mark Anilski has gone on to do some really interesting work, primarily with Indigenous populations. But just to show you the kind of things that review, again, what's taken into account is for baseline inventory and assessment, they look at these things currently and in historical context of what's happening with financial capital, human capital, social capital, natural, and built capital. He is just currently, or just recently, you'll see this Cree Nation tribal grouping in Manitoba. So this is very recent in 2020. And what we're doing now is we're entering into some much more subjective understanding by doing significant and large scale within that community surveys of the values that the people hold dear within that community. And out of that, they create different comparative pictures, which helps develop consensus within the society as to where the major problems are and what the society, the Cree Nation may wish to concentrate on in terms of new policies. It's using some of the Indigenous understanding of directions and medicine wheels. And I didn't know this, but it was actually Maslow came to be aware of the Blackfoot Nation in Alberta, and he actually developed his hierarchy of needs based on some of the work that the Blackfoot had passed on in oral tradition for a long time. This is what Mark is trying to bring into some coherence in discussions as a whole variety of factors to consider well-being. And you'll see here in these surveys, they asked a lot of different questions. I won't pause very long on this one because I have another slide here to drill down. This one, for example, the development of this followed a major consultation. And the question is again and again in different categories, what were important to people in that society? So they might say, as they did, that relationships with extended family were important. So they did a survey about where that came out, or belonging to the community, or feeling safe to walk alone at night, or what's your satisfaction with access to informal education for the skills that you need? How do you feel about the balance of work time and other personal time? So you can see these accounts are very flexible based on what people in a geographic area actually value. And then the whole community can see the results of how it comes out. And it's a very good basis for further discussion about what should be done with different financial resources available to a community. When that survey was done, and then Mark tried to duplicate some of the methodologies that have been done at a national level, it showed that this Cree Nation survey put between third and fourth place the happiness index of that society. And if I just go back, it's actually interesting that the nation did not score so highly on the economic well-being, but they certainly did on some of their spiritual well-being and some of their satisfaction and sense of safety within that community. And so what popped them up to that highest place was not really the economic and dollar value, but so much as other things that those people valued. So I would argue that to a certain degree, there's all sorts of debates about under what circumstance this is useful and not useful. I'd argue that a genuine progress index could in fact restore some balance to public policy and rekindle a sense of hope for those who despair at the decline of environmental health and social cohesion. It could become the defining feature of any new government. What we tend to do, and this just flips over to where I'm currently doing some work at Citizens for Public Justice, we tend to isolate some of our work and reports. So we do measure as a society and institutes and government poverty trends in Canada. And you can see that it's really quite alarming if you look at the percentage of people in the low income category. And once you drill down further, you begin to get a better picture of, in terms of equality and inequality and life chances, how do couples compare with single people? How do racialized people experience poverty in comparison to white people? 20.8% of racialized people at a national level versus 12.2%. You can look at Indigenous people, 23.6 versus 13.8. People with disability, 23.2 versus 8.6. But those studies don't tend to be reflected in the kind of overall health of society that I was indicating was possible to roll up in those genuine progress indices. And so they become siloed to some extent by the few advocates that are out there for a particular minority grouping within Canada, as opposed to having it really embedded in indicators that everybody is acutely aware of and which budget makers would be pressed to take into account if they were well advertised frequently. If you have not already read this, this is a continuation of my colleague, as he's really enjoyed an excellent career in developing this work. This book came out not too long ago, An Economy of Wellbeing, Genuine Wealth and Happiness, Common Sense Tools. I commend it to you as something that I think that many of you would find of significant interest. The punchline of what I've been trying to get across, in case you missed it, is that we should measure what citizens value and make it visible to all to create momentum and to allow us to create economies of well-being. So with that, I'll just say thank you and open up for any discussion. I may be able to answer some questions, and if not, someone else may be able to. Thank you.
All right. We have 3 questions in so far, and I expect more will be coming in. The first one up is Anitra. Anitra, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, I can.
Good. Thank you for an excellent presentation of a really very complicated subject. And I will just, before I comment more on your subject, I'd just like to say you were not unusual in not being able to corral Herman, who's one of our members. He's a very shy person, Herman Daly. And of course, he's been handicapped as a child, and now he's experienced late life polio again and is in retirement. But we couldn't even get him out to accept the Danella Meadows Lifetime Achievement Award to drive from University of Maryland down to downtown Washington, D.C. So he's quite shy about being on TV and doing other things, although he's brilliant. And at one point we had a lot of discussions with our values people, Reverend Father Thomas Berry, who has written a great deal about the value of the earth based on the Amur Indian values, and also John Weaver and some of the other religious people we had along with Herman Daly. But when he was at the World Bank, they stuck him in a little room at the very back of the second floor, and he sort of sequestered away, but wrote magnificent things. But the rest of the people in the World Bank thought he was, very strange for thinking environment had value and all those other things. Just a little history, but I'm very, very interested in what David Korten had to tell us all, which is economics as GDP and other indicators have come to an end, and we really need to think about regeneration of well-being and human well-being, as well as the earth and all its animal and plant and microbial species well-being. And we're working on this. Ted Manning is working right along with us, and Sheila, with David Korten and the International Club, to try to get a handle on what it would look like if we went forward rigorously with regeneration of so many of these things that you have put as the secondary things that are not measured by normal economics, such as wetlands, forests, soil, agriculture, and so forth, as well as families, education of the poor, and regeneration is not beyond our capability, although it's not thought as an important activity, as making money, increasing the GDP, and so forth. So that's an activity that might be built into this kind of a model, is the regeneration of those values that we do have as an opposition to the activity of generating more assets, more wages, more productivity, and so forth in an economic setting. Thank you.
I would just comment, Anitra, that in contrast to Herman Daly, Mark Anielski indicated that he met John Cobb at a conference in Korea last year at age 96. He's still winning strongly. So John has continued in good health. I'm sorry to hear about Herman Daly.
Herman is sequestering away in a tiny place in Florida as a retirement from the World Bank.
I would just say that while I was, as I said, I didn't quite know my audience today. And while I was looking at some of these radar graphs or the circle graph of well-being, in actuality, it was the individual indicators that when we drilled down into those that became probably the most fruitful. And that comes back to, as Ted Manning made a comment, I think, in the chat line here, it does depend which indicators, that you want to lift up and really examine. But I think that when you look at the decrease in the well-being in the natural capital, the whole theme of regeneration just absolutely springs to mind. So I totally agree with you.
Okay, our next comment or question is from Jeff Passmore. Jeff, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks, Art. And thank you, David. Your presentation was not old hat to me. I'd had some familiarity, but I really appreciated the overall presentation. And I want to focus on your comment that we don't take GPI into account when formulating a budget. And I just want to remind you, you probably don't need reminding, but mention to everyone that our current finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, back in 2012, wrote a book called Plutocrats, The Rise of the New Global Super Rich and the Fall of Everyone Else. And she has a real concern, unless she happens to have been overwhelmed by politics. She used to have a real concern for the middle class and trying to do stuff such as you suggested, which is measuring and focusing on what people actually value to prevent in Canada a rise in populism that we have seen in other jurisdictions. So it may well be that this is something that the Club of Rome wants to take on as an initiative, since the government is currently formulating its spring budget, that we request that the Government of Canada take into account when putting together its budget some of the GPI indicators.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think there's room for a project, and some of you have been discussing that, I think, at the Club of Rome level more in an advanced way than I have. I haven't not been a part of those overall international conversations, not until just recently. But yes, I mean, I think there is lots of room for us to make these indications. One of the challenges, I think, that the traditional liberal philosophy, they've still got much of the old pioneer attitude, though, that we live in a country of great promise and perpetual progress measured, in terms of linear growth. And it just has not taken seriously the notions of the finite limits that the biosphere and the environment have thrust upon the globe and upon Canadian society. And so they're caught in almost eternally contradictory debates. If anybody ventures the side of the need for sustainability, to date, at least, it's always the jobs and economic growth side of the equation which have predominated. So I think the change will need to come from a very substantial challenge by various groups of Canadians in various interests. Otherwise, it will only come in time of great catastrophe, I'm afraid. But I do believe it's very valuable for us to make that kind of input.
Okay.
Well, I certainly don't disagree with your comment about the state of the liberal mentality, if you will. I'm just a little bit hopeful that we have a more receptive ear with the current finance minister, perhaps not, however, with the finance department. But yes, that's not a reason for inaction, as you suggested.
Agreed, Jeff. Thank you.
Mary Hagan had a question, but she doesn't seem to be responding to turning her equipment on. She did leave a message, and her comment was, the public, as voter and activists, use their individual indicators. Question, where they get data which they trust?
Good point.
Well, I don't have a fulsome answer to that question because I can't determine, what people are going to, which Canadians are going to trust what, in a divided society with different news silos. I think we're very familiar with the fact that what is a fact to one person may be fiction to another. But I will say that the kind of communitarian and community-based consulting work that Mark Anielski's been doing by going into a community and listening to a significant group of actors within that society, that builds trust. When I worked with CUSO years ago, one of the best indicators for success in a development project was who was involved in the buy-in, who discussed the project. And you could never feel very confident that if you had a head office from CARE International in New York proposing a certain kind of development project, it was not nearly as likely to be successful as a project that had very substantial consultation within the community. So there may not be a lot of shortcuts in today's society from gathering together individuals and groups within a community to help actually rebuild some of that trust and exchange. And I would argue it will be built if you're continually asking and listening about questions and responses to what is of value to those members within a constellation of people.
Okay, Mary, did you want to make a comment yourself?
Thank you, David. Yeah, I've been thinking about, I think national indicators nowadays seem so removed to where most people's heads are at and choices. So I sent another comment to say that I feel that the public, as voters and activists, are probably in a way best defining indicators without even calling it that. And then the question comes down as to the really big one in our discussion online these days is, where do most of the public get their data which they can trust? And that's where it seems to be all over the board. And so as you set up local and national indicator groups, how do you build that new common understanding and consensus? I think it's easier to throw out the GDP as just a minor indicator within a overall set of indicators, but how you replace it seems to be the big question.
Mary, were you there a moment ago when I was talking about processes to bring together community actors at smaller
Yeah.
levels within community? Because I think there's not maybe a lot of shortcuts to the challenge we do have of rebuilding trust among community members. And I think the interaction among community members asking what's best for our society, not using the national as a definition of society, but a much more local community area. I think a lot of this needs to be done from the ground up, because then people are closer to having experiential knowledge and they know it's true whether their sidewalks are being plowed at night or whether they feel safe to walk out at night or they fear crime. Then the knowledge base can be sort of checked against the lived experience. But if you get too abstract and too remote, then you don't have that advantage.
Okay, thank you. Ted
You must
Manning.
have been,
Art,
Yes,
Art, your voice is very, very weak. Can you get closer to the microphone or adjust something?
I'll get closer to the mic. Okay, Ted Manning, you're next.
Yeah, I'm at great risk of actually agreeing with all you people for the first time in a long time. The fact is that people have been trying for years, of course, to come up with one big number that we can impress a politician with or a company with. And in the note I put on the side, it's been a struggle to create any aggregate indicators, because anytime you use 10 different indicators, you're trying to weight them and decide what to go in and what doesn't. And that's just a sort of question of logistics. I agree completely, though, that David, that the actual act of defining what is most important to people, usually at the community level, gets people to pay attention to what it is really worth measuring. And that's what I've been doing for a living around the world with coastal zone and tourism people for decades. It's about the only thing that actually convinces people what's important to them and convinces them that maybe it's not a bad idea to measure them. It's much easier at a local level than a national level. That said, the creation of something like the broader indicators of well-being, I think, remains a big challenge. And we're trying to create that with the Club of Rome, and a lot of the people here, you will be invited to contribute to it, because we all know how to diagnose the problem. We don't yet know how to solve it. And we're going to try and get a bunch of bright people together to share any good ideas they've got to try and see if we can come up with something that will replace and influence the decision process, rather than just, as David Corton said the other day, what's the price? Now, that's not exactly a question, so I should probably end in one. How do we decide what is most important? And David's been talking about the process that they've been going through. How successful has that been in convincing people that there are things more important than the bottom line?
Well, I would argue, Ted, that there's been some benefits in terms of getting sustainable indicators into government, even though it's been hived off into the Department of the Environment.
Yeah.
But I think I would argue that coming to a consensus and arriving at a workable indicator that then gets used all around the world is not nearly as important as the process of getting people conscious
Yeah.
of the whole discussion, so that it becomes, if you take a finance minister, if they're a part of these kinds of discussions, they become more aware of what needs to be taken into account. I think one group in society can certainly argue that there's a set of existential indicators, and I would be tempted to look at indicators that have existential importance. I mean, while somebody with a disability or living in poverty would argue that it's very painful and it may affect their life expectancy, to me, that's a level of degree different than the existential indicators that say if we continue to emit greenhouse gases, then life may not continue to be sustainable, or a whole bunch of other indicators. So my temptation would be to have some debate and discussion around what I would call the existential indicators. But then you need the other less sort of urgent indicators to be kept front and center and made visible to a wide swath of society so that they can be used to lobby and agitate and advocate and try to correct governments and elected members and get it into their election platforms, some of the indicators that we might want in a broader sort of view. But for now, I think a very useful way to start off might have to do with some of the existential ones.
Great answer, David. You're recruited.
Okay, our next question is from Rob. Rob, go ahead.
Thanks, Art. I guess I would like to, thank our speaker, David, for initiating an interesting discussion on what I view as a very important topic. The comment that I'd like to make it from the perspective of a person who worked for Statistics Canada, building the national accounts for a period of about 20 years. I have come to conclude, and this is reflected in our current work with the Pathways Project and the model that underlies it, is that the data in the system of national accounts, which is in some sense the official data of measuring various aspects of the economy, turned out to be perfectly useless for dealing with the energy emissions and climate crisis. Yet almost all of the quantitative analysis that people can do, since they can't afford independent data collection on their own, resorts to using the information as unsuitable as it is in trying to make up and analyze and understand the energy system and greenhouse gas emissions. And I have the distinct feeling that so long as we are stuck using a framework that was developed for short-term cyclical economic analysis to try and deal with a 100-year time horizon problem of climate change, that we're not going to make any real progress. Quite frankly, in this day and age, I can't understand what problems the system of national accounts can actually contribute to. And my sort of flippant suggestion would be that we should abandon the whole thing altogether and rethink the conceptual frameworks and the kinds of information that we have to address the problems that we actually confront. Thank you.
So, Rob, I would just say that on that question, which deserves a whole afternoon of conversation, I think I have not spent my career steeped in the development of these like Mark Anilski has. I think it would be a very valuable conversation to see what someone like Mark might put on the table. I mean, one of the things we were aware of is that there was quite a lot of mix and match in our original documentation. So for example, when you were tracking water quality in Alberta, sometimes you were using national accounts, sometimes you were using more community and provincial accounts, but you were at least using a consistent methodology so that you could have a pretty good idea of whether water quality was improving or it was declining over a period of time, even if your measures were not perfect and the data was not perfect. I don't think it threw out the picture that it created as to the direction that your society was going in with view to runoffs and pollution and growth of algae and a variety of things. So only some of what we looked at in Alberta was drawn from Stats Canada, although we highly used it in many cases. But I don't disagree with you that there may be new and different things that could usefully be done today. But I think it would be useful for those of us that are interested in this topic at some point to draw someone like Mark Anielski into the conversation, because he's right up to date with all of this stuff and I am not.
Okay, we have next comment or question is coming from Rick. Could you unmute yourself?
Yes, I muted because I share this office with my wife. I'm just going online for a minute, Leela. I just can see the difficulty that all of us have been discussing with trying to get agreement on indicators and their relative importance, and all the points that are made, including by the presenter, which I think this is a wonderful presentation. I'm just so happy to be among the audience. But because of the difficulty of finding the indicators, perhaps in the meantime, consideration should be given to allowing the people themselves to show where their preferences lie. And would one way of doing that be to give all Canadians from a certain age a guaranteed income so that they would have the means to determine whether they wanted to get more education or, do whatever they choose to do? That is my question. Guaranteed income, and let the great minds work out what the indicators should be. And I would just add one little point here, and that is one wants to be careful, perhaps, not to get into a situation where it's dividing people between those who have the knowledge which will permit them to make the right decision for the society, while those others could just follow along. At least the guaranteed income might provide a way for everybody to feel that they were having a choice, rather like each man being able to vote. Thank you.
If I could just respond briefly, I number among those who have followed with great interest and admiration the work of Hugh Siegel, for example, over the years. And I'm somewhat familiar with the Manitoba experiment in the communities for a pilot project on guaranteed income. And I was distressed when the Ford government did not allow the guaranteed income experiment in 3 different communities to run its course, because I think we would have learned something valuable from that. And I do think that there's a coincidence of forces in the sense that society is going to be up against the fact that we cannot consume as much in the future in a planet limited with finite resources. And we're not going to need probably as much productive capacity, and there's going to be numbers of people whom I think are going to find employment very difficult in the knowledge-based economy. And I think that there will be political pressures. And I think even the COVID period that we're in now and some of the grants and supports may lead into the possibility of more political support for picking up some of the experimentation around guaranteed income. And I think it would throw into relief some of the kind of results about the choices that people are making. This is why I'm quite keen on the work that Mark is doing with smaller communities, because it's taking into account immediately the things that they value and allows people to track those things. But yes, I'm a proponent and supporter of moving forward with pilot projects that look at guaranteed income more closely.
Okay, thank you. Susha, you're next.
Okay. Thank you, David. It's quite a eye-opening, your presentation, and I'm really pleased to see that we are addressing that. I think COVID, the fortunate part of the COVID is it's sending us a different kind of messages how to evolve, whether it is agriculture, whether it's a production, local manufacturing. So this something is teaching, it's actually teaching us how to have a homogeneous society so that we can start able to live in balance here. Now, one thing I want to bring to your attention, I was in India. I grew up on a farm. I was in India for a couple of months last year. And what I found there, the current government in India is Prime Minister. He's very fond of Trump. And he's using all kind of stuff similar to what Trump is using. And if you are talking about equality, you are called a communist or a terrorist in extreme cases. If people start talking about equality. And the other thing I found, the Indian soil, topsoil and water has really gone down the drain because they're using all kind of herbicide, pesticide, chemical fertilizer to increase the production, and not enough attention is being paid to protect the soil and water. And so something I was thinking during your presentation, I was thinking if we slow down on these chemicals, then our agriculture production globally will go down. Maybe it will bring some balance because there seems to be surplus, wheat prices, those negative things. And, and so I'm wondering whether you have given that side, sustainable agriculture with respect to equality and GPI aspect.
I don't express any expertise in agriculture outside of the fact that when you look at the 100 top things which the group of people have argued can be done to combat climate change, there's a number of aspects of more sustainable agriculture and different forms of grazing among trees rather than the way that it's happening now. So that there's 3 or 4 contributions in the area of sustainable agriculture, which can significantly reduce the greenhouse gas burden. I haven't tried to understand what that does in terms of production per acre, but I take your point that those are important issues.
Okay, Ted, you had another comment to make, and then we will wind this up. Ted Manning, unmute yourself, please.
There we go. Me quiet? Why? How about that? Okay. We've come up with some really good ideas of the range of indicators of what's really important to people, and even some bright ideas on how to find out what they are. So where in fact can KCOR go next? Could we be a catalyst for developing more perspectives on what's really important to Canada? And if we are able to determine this, how can we actually do more effective outreach to the people who might listen? And I think this would be a good opportunity to get David's insights. He's tried to tilt the windmill for a long time. Give us some more ideas.
Nothing like an open-ended question. I suppose Art is going to intervene and say you've got 40 seconds to answer as well.
Right.
Ted, I don't know that I want to shoot from the hip this afternoon on such a complex one. I wouldn't mind thinking a little more and putting together a short, sort of paper of 2 to 3 pages of some things that could be done, I think. But
well, I'm just instigating to see if we can get the rest of them to weigh in as well.
But I'm willing to do that. But what I would say is, years ago we used to do these AHA seminars with a lot of value judgment as to what we thought was wrong with society, and we would divide our analysis up into top hats, and those would be the groups that were trying to preserve the status quo. We're digging in and we're against what we thought was desired and needed social change. And then we went out throughout society and we tried to identify those groups that we called the new powers. And we looked at how we could create coalitions among those new powers and partnerships. And we made some very concerted efforts. And sometimes they were larger efforts. One was around the time of the free trade debates in 1988, around about. Another one was when I was at Pembina, when we were looking at something much smaller, which was tax credits for renewable energy. And it was very interesting. I remember Rick George, who was the CEO of Suncor at the time, and I from Pembina, we went up to Ottawa to meet with some cabinet ministers, and we met with 3 of them in one day in sequence, not together. And every single one of them were interested in the masthead of who was in the Clean Air Coalition. And when they could see that Suncor was in it along with Pembina or Greenpeace or other environmental groups together with other for-profit companies, what jumped to their mind was, good, if we do this, there's not going to be a lot of public outcry and opposition to what we're doing. And I always remembered since that time that creating coalitions of unlikely bedfellows is one of the ways in which you can have maybe maximum impact on driving a proposal to get the attention of legislators. I'll just end with that sort of vignette right now, but I think it's a very important question you're asking, Ted.
Thank
Okay,
you.
John Hollins has the final question, and we'll be winding this up.
Thank you, Art. David, I've waited too long to hear this talk, so thank you for doing it today. I'm aware that Bhutan has had an index of gross national happiness for a number of years. Is there anything we can learn from that's totally different kind of society, much longer history than ours? And have they adopted a guaranteed income? Do you know?
I do not know that.
Okay.
Okay.
I can comment directly on that. I've met the lady. She's now in Canada. She is Canadian, stranded here. Her family's from Vancouver. She's a new member of the Club of Rome, and she is likely to be accessible to us should we ask her to come. But she is the chief advisor on the indicators that have gone behind the index of happiness for Bhutan. And I just told you everything I learned in a very nice conversation with her a couple of months ago. but I think we can probably get her on at some point in future because she's back and forth between Bhutan and Canada frequently. And as I just said, she's stranded for the moment in Vancouver.
The one comment I would make, John, is I think it's important that one knows the intention of what one is trying to accomplish when you're doing these happiness indicators. If you're trying to do international comparisons between Finland and Canada, for example, then you want to have something of a common methodology. But I would argue in a sense that the most useful thing is not happiness indicators that you can compare across nations, so much as what are the values that a particular group of people in time and place, what do they most value?
Yeah.
So a happiness indicator in Ottawa for me would include enough days of frozen ice on the canal and not having a COVID lockdown so that I could enjoy skating on the canal. Now, I doubt very much whether Bhutan would want to include that in their indicator.
Well, we should ask.
Anyway, with that, I'd like to thank you, David. That was an excellent presentation. I'm sure everyone who sat in on this got a tremendous amount out of it, and I do hope that perhaps KCOR can get together and see if we can add to what the Pembina Institute has already done. With that, I'm going to be terminating our recording.